All right, so think about just think about your day to day, right?
Yeah.
Chances are you've used, interacted with something, anything made in China.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really is kind of wild how much stuff comes from China.
It is pervasive.
Yeah, pervasive.
When you think about the screen you're looking at right now, the clothes you might be wearing, a
Right.
component in your car, I mean,
It's everywhere.
it really is.
Yeah, I mean, the scale is crazy. In 2024 alone,
Uh-huh.
the World Bank said that China had 30%, a full 30% of global manufacturing output.
Wow.
And their exports, are you ready for this?
Yeah.
$3.6 trillion.
That is a mind-boggling number, and I think what's really fascinating for people to think about as they go about their day is that it's not just, a few isolated things, right? It's pervasive across so many different industries and sectors.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything from, the most advanced technology to,
Uh-huh.
very basic, you know, needs.
Mm.
But, and this is where it gets interesting and a little bit, I don't know.
Murky.
Yeah. Alongside of this huge, like, economic power,
Yeah.
there's this narrative that's been building about the way that some of these goods are produced, right?
Mm.
And there are some serious allegations of labor abuses, particularly affecting the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. Department of Labor
Yeah.
this year put out a list of goods like cotton, electronics, textiles
Uh-huh.
that potentially are tainted by forced labor.
It really begs the question, what's the human cost, right?
Yeah.
Of this, this juggernaut of manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you have this, this incredible economic expansion, this
Right.
global reach.
Uh-huh.
And then on the other hand, you have these credible reports of some really serious human rights violations.
Yeah, and it really, I think, contrasts with the Chinese government's stance, which is, they consistently deny these claims, and they often kind of frame these labor practices as a way of lifting people out of poverty.
Yeah, and that's what we want to unpack in this deep dive, right?
Yeah.
So for you listening,
Uh-huh.
we want to understand, how did China become this huge manufacturing power, like so quickly?
Yeah.
What are the historical events that led up to this?
Yeah.
How has technology played a role? Are the claims of labor exploitation, including child labor and forced labor, are they substantiated?
Right.
And what does all of this, this incredible manufacturing ability, what does that say about China's ambitions on the world stage?
I think if we zoom out for a second and just think about this, it's about understanding how these massive forces are shaping the global economy
Uh-huh.
and also thinking about the products that we consume every day, right? And the realities behind, the label that says made in China, which is a label that I think we've become so accustomed to. We sort of just glance over it.
Right.
But the story behind that label is actually quite intricate and in some cases very disturbing.
Absolutely. And to even understand, where China is today,
Yeah.
we have to understand, like, the historical background, right?
Uh-huh.
So let's go way back to the roots.
Yeah, let's delve into the historical roots of this, because I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out just how far back this manufacturing prowess actually goes, right?
I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
To think that China, hasn't always been the world's factory.
Right.
I mean, it
Yeah.
has a very significant history and craftsmanship going way, way back.
Uh-huh, for sure.
I mean, when we think about the imperial era, China was famous for its silk.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Porcelain, I mean.
Could name China.
Yeah. It's where the name comes from.
Exactly.
Our fine tableware.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's a direct link.
Absolutely.
And of course, tea, right?
Yeah.
But the Silk Road wasn't just about, trading these goods. It actually established China as a major pre-industrial manufacturing center.
Yeah, it bridged East and West. It was incredibly important.
Yeah.
And I think, what's fascinating for people to think about is that, even centuries ago, China was a center of innovation and production, and their goods were highly sought after all across the world, right? And if you look at, the 18th century, the numbers are they're incredible.
Yeah.
If you look at Angus Madison's research,
Uh-huh.
China's economy was the largest in the world,
Right.
contributing around the third, 33% of global GDP.
A third. That's amazing.
It's incredible.
But, as we move into the 19th century, things start to change a little bit, right?
Yeah.
We see the effects of the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties that followed.
Right.
It's really a turning point, I think, where China is facing this colonial exploitation,
Yeah.
and it stunts their industrial growth.
What happens is that, the Qing dynasty is weakened and they're essentially opened up to all of these external pressures from
Right.
the West, and it really diverts a lot of their resources and their focus away from internal development,
Oh,
right? And more towards trying to deal with these external
yeah.
challenges.
And then you move into the early 20th century, and it's chaos, right?
Right.
You have warlordism, you have the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912, and then a civil war.
Right.
So it's hard to imagine any kind of, real industrial growth taking place.
I mean, during that period, manufacturing was essentially confined to, really small scale industries,
Yeah.
mostly textiles, very labor intensive.
Uh-huh.
There was very little mechanization, and, it was really just about basic survival at that point, as opposed to, any kind of significant industrial output.
Yeah, and then comes 1949
Uh-huh.
and the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
And Mao had this vision of transforming China into this, powerful industrial nation
Uh,
through centralized planning.
yeah.
And this led to the Great Leap Forward.
Right, which was envisioned as this sort of rapid, massive push for industrialization, right? The core ideas were to collectivize agriculture
Right.
and to boost steel production.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time of, immense social and economic upheaval across the country.
And it failed. I mean,
Wow.
it failed catastrophically.
Yeah,
We were talking about the Great Chinese Famine,
right.
which led to the deaths of, estimates for 30 million people.
Yeah, and I think from a manufacturing standpoint,
Uh-huh.
it was really a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, misallocated resources.
Right, the quality of goods just plummeted
Yeah.
because the emphasis was on these unrealistic targets. There was a lack of expertise in terms of planning these industrial policies,
Mhm.
and it just led to widespread inefficiency. And, both the quantity and the quality of goods that were being manufactured really declined.
Right.
So it was a major setback, I think, for
Yeah.
China's industrial ambitions.
But then fast forward to 1978,
Huh?
we see Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy.
Right.
I mean, this is a complete 180.
Yeah, this was a pivotal moment for China, for sure.
Yeah.
There was this shift to a more market-oriented economy
Mhm.
and a focus on export-led growth. And this is really where we see the foundations of the modern Chinese manufacturing sector
Yeah.
being laid. Right.
Yeah.
And the creation of special economic zones like Shenzhen was so important
Right.
because these were zones that were specifically designed to attract foreign investment
Right.
and to incentivize private enterprise.
Uh-huh.
And it essentially created these pockets of, really rapid economic growth.
Yeah. And for foreign companies in the 80s
Yeah.
looking to set up shop, one of the big draws was the low cost of labor.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, we're talking about workers making less than $1 a day,
Yeah.
compared to $10 or $20 an hour in the United States.
Right. I mean, that massive cost advantage was just such a magnet
Yeah.
for, pulling global manufacturing to China.
Yeah, it made it so, I mean, from a business perspective, it made so much sense.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But it wasn't just cheap labor, right?
Right.
I mean, the Chinese government was investing in infrastructure,
Right. And that was key.
building ports and roads and factories.
Yeah. That strategic investment in infrastructure
Yeah.
provided the, essential framework
Yeah.
to be able to support, large scale production
Uh-huh.
and the transport of goods.
Yeah, and then another huge event, I think,
Yeah.
was China entering the WTO in 2001,
Absolutely. Huge.
which really, solidified them
Yeah.
as a global manufacturing hub.
Joining the WTO, it opened up all of these, opportunities for Chinese manufacturers
Uh-huh.
in terms of, accessing global markets.
Right.
And it really integrated China into the global trading system.
Yeah, I mean, their exports, from 2001 to 2010, they went from 266 billion to 1.2 trillion dollars.
That's a staggering,
Yeah,
that's insane.
level of growth.
Yeah.
And so as we look back at this historical overview, I think we see these really clear patterns, right?
Yeah.
State-driven industrialization, strategic policy changes, and this consistent emphasis on economic growth, right?
Uh-huh.
But as you pointed out earlier, it also laid the foundation for a lot of the labor controversies
Right.
that we see today.
Yeah, I mean, all this growth It
Yeah.
it caused this huge migration
Oh,
of workers
right.
from, rural areas to the factories in the cities.
Right.
And, by 2010, over 300 million people
It's incredible.
had made that move.
Yeah.
And, these workers
Uh,
oftentimes faced really difficult conditions.
yeah, absolutely. So,
Okay.
understanding this historical context, I think,
Yeah.
is crucial.
For people to understand both the scale of China's manufacturing success,
Uh-huh.
but also, the potential human cost that
Yeah.
that accompanied it, right?
Mhm.
And it really sets the stage, I think, for the kind of dramatic transformation we've seen in more recent times, right?
Uh-huh.
Which is the shift from this labor-intensive model to something that's much more high-tech and automated.
Yeah, and that's a good segue
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the next part of our conversation, which is
Right.
the modernization of
Right.
China's manufacturing sector.
Right. And I think what's fascinating for people to consider is the speed and the scale of this transformation.
Yeah.
It's not just a gradual evolution, it's been a very rapid
Yeah.
and almost revolutionary change in terms of their
Yeah.
capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, we talked about that. The focus was on cheap labor, right? It was
Yeah.
all about like quantity,
Yeah. Yeah.
Shenzhen, these special economic zones,
Mhm.
just churning out tons and tons and tons of stuff.
Textiles, toys, shoes, you name it.
Yeah, and we talked about the working conditions, but they were, really, really tough.
Yeah, I mean 12, 16-hour day.
Yeah, 6 days a week
Yeah.
for, 50 cents an hour.
Right, which, those conditions were incredibly appealing to Western companies that were looking to, cut costs
Uh-huh.
dramatically.
Yeah, so you saw a lot of outsourcing.
Right.
I mean, big name brands like, Nike and Apple,
Mhm.
they were taking advantage of that.
Yeah.
But then in the 2000s,
Right.
you see this shift
hmm
where the Chinese government starts
Mhm.
to, actively push for modernization.
Right.
And I think a big indicator of that was the Made in China 2025 initiative.
Absolutely. That was a very significant, signal of their intent.
Yeah, which was launched in 2015.
hmm
And the goal of this was, to essentially move up the value chain
Right.
and to establish China as a leader in these high-tech industries.
So Made in China 2025 was a very ambitious and strategically important plan.
Yeah.
It really highlighted sectors like robotics, aerospace, AI as areas where they wanted to make huge investments and
Yeah.
try to become a global leader.
Yeah. And they put their money where their mouth was, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's estimated they invested something like $150 billion
Wow.
over a decade,
Yeah.
in subsidies.
To support companies like
Huawei.
Yeah, Huawei, BYD. I
Right.
mean, that level of state support it's a huge advantage
Yeah.
because it really allows these companies to invest heavily in R&D
Right.
and to scale up their production much, much faster than
Yeah.
they would be able to otherwise, right?
Yeah. I mean, and you see the results, right?
Yeah.
I mean, by 2024, China was the world's largest producer of industrial robots,
That's remarkable.
290,000 a year.
It's an incredible commitment to automation.
Yeah, more than, the U.S. and Japan combined.
Right.
I mean, that's a huge, a huge commitment to automation.
It really does underscore, I think, the magnitude of
Yeah.
their investment in automation.
Right.
And it really it signals this clear move away from
Mhm.
that labor-intensive model
Mhm.
to something that's much more technologically advanced.
Yeah. I mean, we even saw, examples like Foxconn, which is a major supplier for Apple, back in 2016, replace something like 60,000 workers
Wow.
with robots.
I mean, that really gives you a sense of the speed and the scale
Yeah.
at which this is happening, right?
And it's not just the factories, right?
Right.
They've been modernizing infrastructure as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ports, high-speed rail, logistics networks. I mean, it's all connected.
If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, right,
Mhm.
which we'll talk about more,
Yeah.
it's all about, being able to move these goods, more efficiently.
Yeah, the BRI is fascinating because it's, this trillion-dollar
Yeah.
investment in these projects in Asia, Europe, Africa.
Connecting the world.
Yeah, I mean, China by 2024 had the largest high-speed rail network in the world,
It's remarkable, right?
45,000 kilometers.
And that kind of infrastructure, it gives them a competitive edge.
Yeah, but, this rapid expansion, this boom,
Yeah.
has had its downsides, right?
Right.
I mean,
Absolutely.
a lot of
A
pollution.
lot of pollution.
By 2015, they were the world's largest emitter of CO2.
Yeah, huge environmental footprint to think about, right?
Yeah, but
In response to that, though,
yeah.
we've seen this real push from the government for green manufacturing, investing heavily in renewables.
Yeah, I mean, in 2023, $120 billion
Huge sums of money.
in renewable energy. And by 2024, they control 80% of the global solar panel market.
And that really has an impact,
Yeah.
on the global energy landscape.
Yeah, but even in these green technologies, we see these labor controversies
Right.
popping up again.
Absolutely, particularly, in Xinjiang,
Right.
where a lot of the polysilicon used in solar panels
Uh-huh.
is produced.
Yeah, so, I mean, modernization has definitely been good for China in a lot of ways,
Uh-huh.
in terms of, their global standing.
Yeah.
But it also seems like it's deepened some of these labor controversies.
Right, and there's this growing gap, it seems,
Yeah.
between, highly skilled, high-tech workers and then these lower skilled migrant laborers who might still be facing, exploitation.
Yeah, and it shows this tension, right?
Yeah.
Between growth
Uh-huh.
and the well-being of workers.
It really highlights that the narrative around China's modernization
Mm-hmm.
is not this, simple story of progress, right?
Right.
There are a lot of ethical and social considerations that people really need to, understand.
And we can't talk about modernization without talking about technology,
Of course.
which has been a huge factor, right?
Right. I mean, technology is really the driving force
Yeah.
behind, so much of this transformation.
Yeah.
And it's gone way beyond just simple automation, right? To include, really sophisticated digital innovation.
I mean, look at robotics.
Uh-huh.
By 2024, China accounted for over half of global industrial robot installations.
That's incredible.
And they have their own companies, right?
Right.
Like Xiaosun, DJI, who are leading the way.
Uh-huh.
And the impact on productivity is huge, right?
Yeah, I mean, we saw that example with BYD, where robotic arms can assemble,
Yeah.
more than double the number of EV batteries per hour compared to a human.
It's crazy.
I mean, that kind of efficiency gain is huge, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's definitely contributing to their dominance in the EV market.
Absolutely.
I mean, 60% of global EV production in 2024.
Right. It's a testament to their technological, superiority in that sector.
But it's more than just, physical robots. I mean, we're seeing AI, we're seeing the Internet of Things.
Yeah, smart factories are becoming the norm,
Uh-huh.
where you have these IoT sensors that are collecting data, in real time.
Yeah.
They can predict when maintenance is needed,
Uh-huh.
Minimize downtime. It leads to a much more efficient process.
Yeah.
And the example of, Hair, their smart factory in Qingdao,
Uh-huh.
reported a 30% efficiency increase
Wow.
after implementing IoT back in 2023.
Yeah, and then you see, AI being used to optimize supply chains,
Mm-hmm.
like Alibaba's Cainiao logistics network, processing 1 billion packages on Singles Day.
It's a mind-boggling amount of, data and processing power.
Yeah, and the state is really supporting all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, huge government investment in digital infrastructure, $1.4 trillion since 2015,
That's incredible.
including, 5G, which by 2024 was covering 90% of urban areas.
And government policies that are really designed to foster innovation.
Yeah.
Tax breaks for tech firms. I mean,
Right? Like Huawei, they got, what was it, $9 billion in subsidies in 2023.
it's a significant level of support.
Yeah.
And it really shows you how committed the government is.
Yeah, but as with other aspects of China's manufacturing story,
Yeah.
there are controversies.
Right. Technology is not a simple, it's not a panacea.
Right.
It comes with its own set of challenges.
One of them being job displacement.
Of course.
I mean, you're automating all these tasks.
Yeah.
What happens to the workers?
Right. What happens to the millions of workers, that were previously doing those jobs?
Yeah. And then you have the issue of surveillance,
Right.
especially in Xinjiang,
Mm.
where they're using, apps, facial recognition to track workers.
Yeah, it raises a lot of ethical questions.
Yeah, and it enables these forced labor programs.
Right. So it's a case of technology being used, not for progress.
Yeah.
Not for improving conditions.
Right.
But rather for control and exploitation.
And you see technology as a big part of China's global ambitions, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, they want to be a leader in 5G, in AI,
Right.
EV production.
Right.
But again, there's that question of,
Yeah.
how those materials for those technologies are sourced.
Right. So where are these components coming from?
Yeah.
And what are the labor practices?
The U.S. Department of Labor even flagged, Chinese lithium-ion batteries and electronics
Yeah.
as potentially being made with child labor, connected to cobalt mines in the DRC.
And China has a huge presence in that supply chain.
Right.
So it really highlights that while technology is incredibly powerful,
Yeah.
it's not neutral,
Right.
right? Its impact depends entirely on,
Uh-huh.
the ethical framework within which it's used.
Yeah, and that brings us to, one of the most, I don't know, the most sensitive and morally challenging aspects
Yeah.
of China's manufacturing, the labor controversies, and specifically the allegations of child labor and forced labor.
Right. This is where the story of China's, economic rise, I think, becomes very troubling, right?
Yeah.
The scale and the gravity of these allegations are really something that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of international outcry.
Uh-huh.
Organizations like the U.S. Department of Labor Human Rights Watch
Yeah.
have documented some really, really disturbing findings.
Yeah.
And, we mentioned that 2024 list from the U.S. Department of Labor
Right.
that identified, you know, a dozen goods from China
Mm-hmm.
that potentially were
Yeah.
made with, exploitative labor.
These aren't just, vague or unsubstantiated claims, right?
Right.
There are very specific products and sectors that
Yeah.
have been repeatedly credibly
Uh-huh.
linked to these practices.
So let's start with child labor.
Okay.
Historically, it's been tied to, hardship in rural areas.
Right.
But even with China's growth, it hasn't gone away.
No.
The legal working age in China is 16,
Yeah.
but there are reports of, with kids as young as 13 working in factories,
Yeah.
particularly in textiles,
Uh-huh.
electronics.
That New York Times investigation back in 2008
Yeah.
where they rescued over 100 children
Uh-huh.
aged 13 to 15 in Dongguan,
Yeah.
who were working these, incredibly long hours, 300 hours a month for
Yeah.
almost no pay.
And, it's not just in China, right? I
Right.
mean, the U.S. Department of Labor has flagged these Chinese lithium-ion batteries
Yeah.
because of the child labor that's potentially happening in the cobalt mines
In the DRC.
in the DRC. Yeah.
And Chinese companies control something like 80% of that supply chain.
Yeah.
So it really it raises these questions about, the oversight
Uh-huh.
and the accountability throughout the whole production process.
Right.
And, the DRC is a good example of how,
Yeah.
these issues are global.
Yeah.
Right. And they're interconnected.
Yeah.
It's not just about what's happening within China's borders. It's about, the impact of Chinese manufacturing practices on labor standards around the world.
And then there's this whole issue of vocational schools
Right.
that are forcing students,
Mm-hmm.
as young as 14
Yeah.
into these factory internships.
Right. And these internships, they kind of blur the line, right?
Yeah.
Between, legitimate training and exploitation.
Yeah. They're threatened with failing if they don't do it.
Right, right.
And this has been happening
Mm.
for at least a decade, in the electronic supply chain.
It's a real concern
Yeah.
for, these young people's well-being.
Yeah. And, Chinese government has